the depths to which Trump and his minions have gone with the disinformation related to these hurricanes and hurricane relief, it strains credulity. It's just absolutely insane. And there are real lives involved here, David.
Yeah. Well, you're being very polite. The assertion by Marjorie Taylor Greene that they, unspecified, but I think we know she's talking about Jewish people, they control the weather and therefore are behind the hurricanes is just a perfect example of the kind of idiots that have been thrown up by the Trump Republican Party. There's another lawmaker who said the other day, I've lived in Florida or wherever it is in the South my whole life. I've never seen a hurricane follow this path. And it was one of the hurricanes, if not Helene, that was coming from sort of Mexico toward the U.S. Happens all the time. And of course, all of this is a way to avoid dealing with the fact that these unbelievably intense storms and the damage they do long-term as well as immediately are the result of denialism about climate disruption. There's a study that came out a couple of days ago in which demographers and epidemiologists went through data following, I think it's 501 major storms. And what they showed is that by following for 15 years, that there's a substantial spike within the damage zone of premature deaths. So, for example, you survive the terrible flooding that damaged your house, but your spouse doesn't. You're probably going to be depressed and otherwise troubled by the loss of your spouse, especially if you're older. And you may not have the money to properly fix up your house. So you're going to live in a house that has mold in it. And lo and behold, instead of your actuarial life expectancy, you die quite a bit earlier. And the number of deaths they estimate per storm of this kind, normally we hear a handful of people died, a few dozen people died. In the case of Helene, so far, a little over 200. But they argue the real death tolls range from 7 to 15,000 per incident, 7 to 10,000 per incident. And we need to recognize that this is a real serious matter if we don't get serious about the level at which we are burning fossil fuels, because the pace of climate disruption is clearly speeding up.
Yeah, the path, just to start with what you had started with, the paths of these systems hasn't changed. The intensity, as you correctly said, is the thing that has changed. And hurricanes are a transfer of heat energy. It's the greatest transfer of heat energy from one hemisphere to the other that nature has. And so as we've supercooked the oceans and we've supercooked these bodies of water, we have created these monsters. And to your point, David, we tend to, and this is a weird public policy thing, we tend to worry about the cleanup, and we don't worry about, in some way, mitigating the threat. It's an odd thing. I guess that's just...
Well, to be fair, human beings as a group, it's pretty hard to think about the future. And the ancient Greeks pretty much denuded the trees that are in Greece, which was not even then particularly thick with trees. Nobody said, oh, wait a minute, we need to preserve those trees for the next generations. That is a relatively new development, that a portion of the American and European populations now embrace this idea that indigenous peoples, of course, long had, that you need to think not about the time you're alive, but about the future generations to come. Industrialism is completely antithetical to that. It's how quickly can we make a profit? And we allow all sorts of externalizing costs. So you make some product, you take something out of the ground that makes you a lot of money, but it pollutes. You leave a factory or grounds that are soaked with toxic materials behind, and you walk off, leaving everybody else with those costs. We need to have better thought through policies about these things. We don't want to discourage people who are going to create and add wealth, but at the same time, you and I shouldn't be stuck with the costs from somebody who, built their 100-room mansion in the year 1900 and then stuck us with millions or billions of dollars in bills because of the mess they left behind.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the corporate ownership of those toxins and those pollutants, that should be good public policy. And yet, as you suggested, the pace of things and capitalism, I would say, and I'm a capitalist all the way, but I'm just saying that right now we're organized for the profit with, and damn the consequences type thing.
Right. I mean, rules matter. Capitalism only works when you have rules. People say, well, we need a free market. There's no such thing as a free market. All markets have rules. On Wall Street, on anywhere else, buying a house, markets have rules. And who writes the rules and how much they address things like avoiding scamsters, limiting damage from misconduct that spills over to others, those are really important to the society as a whole. And keep in mind something I think is very crucial, and I've criticized a number of public figures for this, including some leading economists. There is no such thing as deregulation. There is only new regulation or re-regulation. And the general tenor of this for the last 50 years is that the new regulations take away rights from consumers, weaken the public sphere, and benefit those people who we have the regulations in place to deal with for our safety, for our health, for our general welfare.
Just to put a button on the hurricane stuff, under Project 2025, and I was making this point in the first hour, they would dismantle the National Weather Service and NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. It wouldn't exist. So you would have
yes,
no
we
National
have to get rid of
Center.
these institutions that help us know that there's death coming in a couple of hours or a couple of days, because after all, that would cost tax dollars, and we can't have that.
Well, I mean, and I wonder, and I presume they would probably privatize all of that. There would be private industry to come in. The whole thing is an effort to privatize, isn't it, David?
Yes. And, I asked my students yesterday morning, and just in passing, I said, now, what's it cost to send a first-class stamp? I said, I don't know, because we bought hundreds of forever stamps several times in the past, and I've lost track. And one of the students said, oh, I think it's $5 a letter now. And I said, yeah, I'm not sure the price. I think it's about 70 cents. But I will tell you that if you go to either of the two big commercial services, UPS, United Parcel Service, UPS, or Federal Express, FedEx, and you want to send a third-day letter over, now it's 73 cents, okay. Yeah. You want to send a letter third-day delivery, which is the slowest they offer. I did it a few days ago. $28. Wow. For what amounts to a first-class letter.
Right.
$28. So privatizing, sure, you can privatize. They won't come to your house every day as the post office does. And if you're a small business somewhere out in the countryside, they're not going to serve you hardly at all. In fact, in many cases, places like UPS have a deal for the final delivery point to be done by the Postal Service because it's a universal service.
And when it comes to weather events where you need constant updates on a changing situation, if you subscribe to some play-to-pay or pay-to-play service, you'll get that information, but otherwise you won't. Just in this vein, and then I want to get to the politics of what's happening now, just in terms of the race, as we're so close. But in this vein, your favorite subject, Donald Trump, it just astounds me. His latest thing has been this crypto venture alongside the watches, the Bibles. There's a wild thing with the Bibles, David, where the schools in Oklahoma are going to buy all of these Trump Bibles. I mean, and the sneakers, et cetera. To call it tacky is polite. It's a grift unlike anything I could ever imagine.
Well, remember, this was a guy who claimed to be worth over $10 billion back in 2015. And when he had to file with the government, by my count, he had $1.4 billion. By Forbes's count, it was about 3.4, neither of which were close. And both of mine and Forbes, I think, were vastly inflated because they made assumptions about the value of the Trump name. But real billionaires, people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Cuban, are not out there hawking the kinds of things that he is. Donald is just always desperate for another injection of cash. And this crypto thing is very troubling. Today's New York Times has a piece with only a one column head below the fold on the front page of Business, unfortunately, because I think this should have been much more prominently played. But the Donald Trump crypto coin, and remember, Donald for years said crypto's a scam. The people behind it are scamsters. They have a long record of ripping people off, not paying their bills, cheating on their taxes. If you're not a New York Times subscriber, if you just register, you get 10 free articles a month. And I would really encourage people to read this article. It tells you Donald Trump always says, I only hire the best. I'm only involved with the best. Well, these people, they are well-documented scamsters. There's another article my daughter Amy found for me in which one of them describes his ability to sell excrement wrapped in urine and get people to pay for it because they're fools. And in addition, the Times article quotes these scamsters Trump is working with as saying that Barron Trump, a freshman in college, is a visionary on crypto. That screams how much this is just another scam coming. And they're pitching this as a way to reduce the federal debt. I can't imagine what it is they're thinking, but now it's not just Trump running a scam to line his own pockets. He is proposing here that somehow the government become involved in this.
Right. And should he become president, he could very much affect the value of these holdings that he has and that his followers have. Chase Harrow is an online salesman who proudly calls himself a dirtbag of the internet, able to sell anything to anyone. That's in reference to kind of what you were just saying. Zachary Folkman, the other guy who's involved in this, his partners, ran a company called Date Hotter Girls, offering advice under a pseudonym on how to pick up women at bars. And of course, Barron didn't show up even for the rollout, the big announcement. And Harrow and Folkman have a history of jumping from project to project. Together or separately, they formed at least 17 companies gravitating to the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Of course, both of those are tax havens. And a lot of these are social media marketing and selling advice on how to get rich quick. So,
these guys are real serious scammers. And this is indicative of Donald. Donald has no judgment. So you flatter Donald, you tell him he's wonderful, he's a genius, and he just eats out of your hand. And so you have a con artist, Donald, being conned by other people and trying now to con the general public.
And the Bible thing is this, we
used to, I've written over my career a number of stories about how somebody tried to rig a government bid. There was a time in California when the Highway Patrol wrote the bids for new highway patrol cars so that only Dodge could get the contract, and the same Sacramento Dodge dealer got the contract year after year until Lou Cannon at the San Jose Mercury exposed this. Like, this is 60 years ago almost. And the contract that's been proposed for the Oklahoma schools to buy these Bibles, which I think is a perfectly improper use of state funds, it requires that the Bible have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and something else in it.
The Pledge of Allegiance, I think. Yeah.
The what?
Pledge of Allegiance, I believe.
Yeah,
also.
The Pledge of Allegiance.
Yeah.
And the only Bible known to have that is the Lee Greenwood Bible that Donald Trump has been hawking and signing as if he's the author, which is, of course, part of his effort to sell to the really gullible that he's God. And, he says, I alone can save you. There's all sorts of material out there that Donald Trump is God's agent. And then, of course, there's some counter material saying that, the Bible warns there'll be an Antichrist. And when he arrived, Christians started embracing him. His name is Donald Trump. But it is indicative of how the people around Trump have lost sight of fundamental principles about the American Constitution and our system and our history of this country being founded to get away from state religion.
Yeah, there's a lot wrapped up in this, not to mention the grift, as you suggest, which was related to the specificity with which they sought bidders for this Bible stuff. So,
Yeah.
as you see the state of the race, it seems to be in a kind of a zone where both sides are baked in, both within the margin of error. Certainly, the most recent polling would suggest trends in Harris's direction, but they're minuscule. I mean, they're incremental.
Yeah.
I wonder if how do you assess things now?
Well, first of all, in the popular vote, she's going to romp compared to Donald. I had said Joe Biden would win by 10 million votes this time around. I think she may well win by 15 million or more votes. But of course, we don't elect by popular vote. This election is about 7 states, and very tiny numbers in those states can matter. 2 of those states, Nevada and Arizona, are next door to California. So if you live in California, what I would encourage you to do is call up people, one of the campaigns of a member of Congress, local Democratic or Progressive Party people, indivisible, move on. And if you can afford to do it, drive over to either Nevada or Arizona to get people to the polls on November 5th. This is all about who turns out to vote in those states. The problem with polls, and I think I've mentioned this before, is that fewer than 1 in 100 people, and in some polls fewer than 1 in 200, who answer the telephone will answer the questions. And so I don't think we have truly random samples of the electorate in these polls. And usually over a long period of time, polls sort of keep their trend lines. We keep happening up with these individual polls that the numbers change significantly from one week to the next. So I think that's further evidence that the technique of polling in this election and in the era of cell telephones is not particularly reliable. It seems to be a problem bigger, I think, than the problem that arose in 1948, where they started doing polls by telephone numbers. And the numbers showed the Republicans were much stronger than turned out to be the case when the ballots were counted, because people who had higher incomes tended to have phones, and people who had lower incomes and voted for Democrats didn't. That's the famous Dewey beats Truman headline in the Chicago Tribune. So the concern, I think, is entirely the Electoral College. And once we get past this election, I hope that we start a serious discussion about either removing the Electoral College or altering it in some way. For example, just because California only has 2 senators and Wyoming has 2, even though California has about 75 or 80 times the population, that doesn't mean the Electoral College, we can't say that California gets 6 electoral votes for the Senate side, or 8 or whatever. Otherwise, in the long run, we're going to end up with a country run based on the rural states.
Sure.
And that's not where the wealth is created. It's not where the intellectual development is taking place. It is not where the populations live.
Yeah, the Electoral College has consistently let down the voice of the people, but it clearly benefits so many people who are on the right. I'm talking about politically. That
right.
It's the same thinking as to Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia and places that should have a vote in Congress but don't, for political reasons. David, I just feel like this is an intractable thing. Although on the Electoral College issue, there was a real effort, and is an ongoing real effort to change that, and it's much closer than people think. In other words, it's not like, oh, we have to introduce a bill into Congress. Isn't that right? I mean, there's an ongoing.
No, it's a constitutional amendment question. But just keep in mind, the last 8 elections, the Democrat won the popular vote, but that didn't mean the Democrat got in the White House. And that tells you that the system is not producing what the popular will wants in these elections. The only Republican who's won a majority was George W. Bush in 2004. Otherwise, the Republicans who became president were minority winners.
Tony, can you play for David K. Johnston the latest Kamala Harris ad? I just wanted to get his thought on it. Do you have it? I sent you the newest ones just dropped in the last couple of yesterday, actually. The newest couple of Kamala Harris ads dropped yesterday, and here is one of them, and I'm just wanting to get your thought on it. Here we go.
I worked in the Trump administration.
Never in a million years did I ever think that I'd be working in the White House with a president that didn't care about the American people.
He would suggest not giving disaster relief to states that hadn't voted for him.
I remember one time after a wildfire in California, he wouldn't send relief because it was a Democratic state. So we went as far as looking up how many votes he got in those impacted areas to show him these are people who voted for you. This isn't normal. The job of the president is to protect Americans, regardless of politics.
If Trump's elected again, there'll be no one to stop his worst instincts. You'll have yes men help him implement Project 2025's agenda. Unchecked power, no guardrails.
They will be serving one man. I am voting for Kamala Harris because she will put the safety and security of every American first, whether they voted for her or not.
This is part of this effort, David, to showcase those who worked with the Trump administration or voted Republican and who have now come across. Yeah. I'm wondering if you can give me a thought or two.
Well, you know, they're very nicely professionally produced ads, but frankly, I think you get far more bang for your buck if they build up even more the ground games in the 7 states that are in play. Nothing works better than knocking on doors. There have been people elected to Congress in 2 districts I've lived in my life. When I lived in Sunnyvale by San Jose, and when I lived in East Lansing, Michigan, where a nobody ever heard of spent a whole year knocking on doors in their congressional district, and they got elected. And I think that's what matters here is getting people out on election day. The political science research that I've seen indicates that ads shift about 0.3% of voters. That can be enough in a close election to shift things, but far more cost and same old approach instead of knocking on doors. And Harris has the benefit of how much the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision and Donald Trump's boasting until recently about how he got rid of Roe versus Wade, got rid of the Roe decision, to turn out very motivated people to support her campaign. I have a piece that will be up before we talk next week about the significance of what it will mean should Donald Trump win the Electoral College, and what you can almost what is highly likely to happen and what may happen, and all of it's bad for the economy, for your liberty, for people elsewhere in the world who don't want to live under the boot of the Kremlin, Beijing, other dictatorial regimes who Donald thinks are just great.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he relates Viktor Orban in some kind of positive framing during the debate was just astounding to me. And so I can't wait to read that piece. And just apropos of the Kremlin and Putin, I wanted to finish up by asking you about 2 things. First, your comment on the breaking news, which comes out of Bob Woodward's new book, which is that apparently Trump sent Putin these COVID tests. This is in the very early days of COVID, when the tests were like they were a piece of gold, like a nugget of gold. And he sent and subsequently sent them to Putin, and then subsequently had these ongoing conversations with Putin. There are some reports, and I thought in the Woodward book, I'll have to see, they were almost daily conversations he was having with Putin. I wanted to get your thought on that, and then to the war.
Well, first of all, don't measure this by the hard-to-find nature of this and the cost. I mean, sending a handful, even 100 tests to Vladimir Putin could be a smart strategy. Per se, we shouldn't question the judgment of a president doing something like that because it could have other benefits that are not obvious to us. That said, I wonder, A, why Woodward didn't report this in one of his previous books, particularly since he was the one who showed that Donald knew perfectly well COVID was going to kill huge numbers of people and said the opposite in public. And, essentially Donald Trump effectively killed 1 million Americans by his mishandling of the COVID pandemic. Secondly, though, Woodward makes this point that Putin and Trump were, and I've not read the book, I've only read news reports about it, but that they were talking constantly, several times a week. That's very troubling, especially given that Trump had the 2 infamous meetings, one where the only person with him was the U.S. translator, and he tore up her notes, which is arguably a prosecutable felony. And secondly, he went completely alone to meet with Putin for hours. So we have no idea what took place in these meetings, but you can be sure that Russian intelligence mined everything Trump did from, when he smiled and when he frowned, to understand how to manipulate Trump as president. We want presidents talking to foreign leaders. We want people like General Milley, when he was head of the Joint Chiefs, to get on the phone and reassure military leaders elsewhere in the world about what's happening, even though Trump attacked that and said it was traitorous. But the patterns of things, those we need to pay very close attention to. And this new Woodward material is very disturbing. And so is, why did Woodward decide that this didn't go in his earlier book? Woodward is not a guy who sits around going, ooh, how much more money can I get for this? He's got more money than he knows what to do with. And I hope somebody asks him, why did you leave this out?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, because it's, as you say, it would have dovetailed so well with some of the other stuff, the revelations around COVID from his other book.
I do think it's incredibly important, though, for us to pay attention to, had we followed the science on COVID as South Korea did, which had its first case the same day we did, and you look at the death rates from the countries that followed the science, and then you adjust for our population, and close to 1 million people died because of Donald Trump's incompetence and, more importantly, his lying to the public. When he knew better, he'd been told better. He's getting, Rolls-Royce level care because he's the president of the United States, and people are dying. And I don't think we should let him off the hook for this. It is the most abominable thing. More people died because of Donald Trump's mismanagement of the COVID pandemic, starting with his firing the whole pandemic team on the national security team in the White House that Barack Obama had put there to have very early intelligence, then died in World War II, all the wars since the Civil War. That's just a horrible thing to contemplate.
Sure. Yeah. And it's interesting. You remind me of the lies he told when he got COVID, because I always hear about, well, Trump's authentic. He may be this gross guy who says inappropriate things, but he's speaking his mind and he's authentic. He's lying constantly, and that was one of the big lies around COVID. When he got it, it was just it was.
Donald lies as easily as you and I breathe. It's just who he is, and people need to recognize that, and they need to recognize that he doesn't know anything. I mean, the most scary part about him is he doesn't know anything. I mean, he asserted nobody could see this pandemic coming. Are you kidding? Epidemiologists. People who paid any attention have known this was coming for a long, long time. There will be more pandemics. It's part of the human condition. And as soon as we got jetliners, it is absolutely surprising it took until 2020 to get a really serious global pandemic, because what's better for a virus that's going to kill you than a jetliner?
Right, exactly, to get it worldwide. And as you say, one of the pieces of evidence for that is the fact that there was a team in place and a playbook in place as to how to handle an oncoming pandemic. Right. And he threw it all away because it had Obama's name on it. Okay, quickly to Russia. Again, to this Russia, Ukraine back and forth, you had noted to me that Russia is running out of enough cash and foreign cash, and they've turned to barter instead.
The Russians have a Russian business has a deal with Pakistan to swap Pakistani oranges and potatoes for Russian lentils and some other food stuff. I mean, first of all, the idea that Russia has to import potatoes is extraordinary because they're a huge potato producer, but they don't have any cash to clear transactions. That tells you that the sanctions that the Biden administration and our allies have put in place, sanctions are usually, they're just cosmetic. These are not cosmetic. These are having a real impact on the Russian economy. The Russians have been bringing out World War II era tanks and other equipment that was in mothballs. You know, they pack it in Greece. We have equipment from World War II the same way. They're running through that. They don't have money to import parts that they need to build new tanks and other equipment. And what that says to me, plus the Ukrainians have done some brilliant maneuvers recently. They've taken down another AWACS type air surveillance plane that the Russians are down, I think, to 3 of them now, maybe 4, 3 in Russia, and there's 1 they keep in Syria. The military strategy of the Ukrainians, it's going to be studied for as long as we study warfare as human beings. It's been remarkable. And Russia is reduced to bartering for goods. I'm sorry, we've had coinage for at least 2,500 years, and they don't have any coin. They're down to bartering. It's a highly inefficient system, and it tells you that keeping the pressure on Putin will have benefits. And if there's anything I think Kamala Harris has been clear about in foreign relations, there are 2 things, actually. One is she will be even tougher with Putin on the invasion of Ukraine. She's going to press to get this over with, which means you have to make the Russians give up, which is probably the end of Putin's regime, his dictatorial regime. And secondly, she's made it pretty clear that she will be much tougher on Netanyahu because 40,000 dead Palestinians, over 1,400 dead Israelis is just not a proportional response. And now that you see Netanyahu invading Lebanon and doing the same thing, demolishing civilian buildings, I think it's very clear what Netanyahu's up to. And she's going to want to avoid addressing this in the campaign because I don't think there's any upside to this. But I think
it's interesting, though, David, because she's paying tougher. Didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted on that point. I wanted to say that she's being in Michigan. She's in, I'll put it this way, there's some political headwinds associated with the Arab community in Michigan for her. Yeah. So she's paying a political price in Michigan, even though relative to Trump, she is, as you suggested, likely going to be much tougher on the government of Israel.
Yeah, I listened to an NPR report the other day from Dearborn, which is probably the most concentrated Muslim population in America, certainly very close to it. And a number of speakers who are going to vote for Trump because he says he'll put an end to the war. There's no evidence Donald has any capacity to do that whatsoever. And given his statements about Benjamin Netanyahu, I think he'd take we haven't put handcuffs on him, but we've put some restrictions on things for Netanyahu. There's no reason at all to think that he would be any better for Palestinians, for Arabs living in Lebanon than Kamala. And one of the things that tells me is that there's a lot of inchoate political thought in America, and there's a great deal of, if it isn't perfect, then I'm against it. You never want perfect to be the enemy of the good, because if you make perfect the enemy of the good, you're really going for the bad.
Yeah, that's so well said, and that it's so applicable in this particular moment in politics. When is your column dropping, the new one that you mentioned? Where you
I don't know. I got to finish writing it, but I'm hoping in a day or two. But it's going to say some things some people may think are kind of out there, but they're things we need to be thinking about. I regret that when the Sandy Hook shooting occurred, which was 2010, I wrote a column for whoever I was on contract with at the time that if a shooter showed up and killed an entire school, everybody there, all the classes, all the teachers, that gun laws wouldn't change. And my wife persuaded me that I shouldn't publish that piece. This one, now I'm publishing this piece because I think people need to understand what is likely to happen and what absolutely can happen if Donald Trump gets back into office. And thank you to Johnston, 2012 was Sandy Hook, 2012. So I was with Reuters at the time.
And it'll be a DC report. Is that just to double check?
No, the New Republic. I'm doing this
New
for
Republic.
The New Republic.
Okay, at New Republic. Good stuff. David, love your takes. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We'll talk next Tuesday. David K. Johnston.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.